Καλό σας απόγευμα. Καλωσορίσατε όλοι στην διάλεξη που θα δώσει σε λίγο ο Andrekos Varnava, ο καθηγητής Andrekos Varnavas. Σας μιλάω εκ μέρους της ελληνικής Ορθόδοξης κοινότητας Νότιας Αυστραλίας, η οποία είναι και ο δημιουργός του Odyssey Festival, που συνεχίζει για 20 χρόνια τώρα στην παροικία μας, και μέσα σε αυτά τα πλαίσια η ελληνική κοινότητα αποφασίζει πάντα, όπως δώσει και μερικές εκδηλώσεις εκτός του χώρου της ελληνικής κοινότητας, ώστε να συνεχίζει να γίνεται αυτή η επαφή ανάμεσα στον ελληνικό χώρο. Χθες το βράδυ είχαμε μια μεγάλη χοροσπερίδα στο Olympic Hall, τιμή αφιέρωμα στον Στέλιο Κατσατσίδη, μεγάλη επιτυχία. Όπως γνωρίζετε, έγινε και το επίσημο άνοιγμα του φεστιβάλ την προηγούμενη εβδομάδα. Θα έχουμε το Film Festival, το φεστιβάλ κινηματογράφου, την ερχόμενη Πέμπτη, ανοίγει τις πόρτες του στο Nova Cinema, στο Prospect. Όσοι δεν έχετε κλείσει ή θέλετε να κλείσετε να δείτε κάποια ταινία, η ταινία που θα παιχτεί στην έναρξη του φεστιβάλ είναι πάρα πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα, βασισμένη σε ένα διήγημα του Νίκου Καζαντζάκη και έχει τον τίτλο «Καπετάν Μιχάλης». Και είναι από την ιστορία της Κρήτης, για τον απελευθερωτικό αγώνα της Κρήτης. Νομίζω αξίζει τον κόπο όλοι να το παρακολουθήσουμε το έργο αυτό. Και μια σειρά από άλλες ταινίες που θα παιχτούν στα πλαίσια του φεστιβάλ. Και στο τέλος του φεστιβάλ Οδύσσια θα έχουμε και ένα ανοιχτό πανηγύρι, πάλι στο Olympic Hall, με ελεύθερη είσοδο για όλο τον κόσμο, όπου θα έχουμε μια μεγάλη παροικιακή ορχήστρα. Θα είναι μια μουσικοχορευτική βραδιά. Θα υπάρχουν φαγητά, πιωτά, απ' όλα, αλλά όπως είπαμε η είσοδος θα είναι ελευθέρα και όλοι είναι ευπρόσδεκτοι. Αυτό θα γίνει την 1η Νοεμβρίου του 2025. Τώρα θα ήθελα να προσκαλέσω τον καθηγητή Andrekos Varnava, ο οποίος θα μας μιλήσει για την κυπριακή μετανάστευση στην Αυστραλία μέχρι το 1952, αλλά όπως μου έχει πει θα επεκταθεί και λίγο για τα επόμενα χρόνια. Ένα αρκετά ενδιαφέρον θέμα και γι' αυτό θεωρήσαμε σωστό η διάλεξη αυτή να γίνει εδώ στην κυπριακή κοινότητα, να τη μοιραστούμε με την κυπριακή κοινότητα και με την κυπριακή πατριά, γιατί είναι μεγάλο το ενδιαφέρον. Βέβαια, ο Andrekos βγάζει και μια σειρά από βιβλία. Σύντομα μου είπε θα εκδώσει και βιβλίο για αυτή του την εργασία και θα κυκλοφορήσει. Και πιθανόν σε περίληψη να καλύψουμε και το θέμα αυτό, ίσως στην εφημερίδα, ίσως κάπου αλλού, ούτως ώστε περισσότερος κόσμος να ενημερωθεί, να διαβάσει, να ξέρει, ας πούμε, για την ιστορία μας σαν Κύπροι σε αυτή την καινούργια πατρίδα. Στο τέλος θα γίνουν και μερικές ερωτήσεις, τις οποίες ο Andrekos θα έχει την ευχαρίστηση να τις απαντήσει. Θέλω να ευχαριστήσω τον πρόεδρο της Κυπριακής Κοινότητας, τον Χρήστο Ιωάννου, για τη συνεργασία αυτή που πάντα η ελληνική και η κυπριακή κοινότητα έχουν μια πολύ θερμή σχέση και συνεργασία και ελπίζω και εύχομαι η συνεργασία αυτή να συνεχιστεί για πάντοτε. Andrekos, στο βήμα σας.
Θέλετε να το χρησιμοποιήσουμε?
Νομίζω, δεν ξέρω, νομίζω έχεις και εσύ την αντιφωνή που η Ελλάδα. Ακούτε έτσι.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Let me start by thanking the Greek Orthodox community of South Australia and the Cypriot Community of South Australia for co-hosting this event, for asking me to be present here and speak about my research. I'd like to typically thank Sophie for inviting me and organising this event. Okay.
If you keep it close to your mouth.
You think? I might break out in Ppiros then. Okay, so I'll just talk loudly, and I think everybody can hear me, and it's all good with it? Okay, all right. So, Odyssey Panikos, like Panikos said, this is the title of my next book, which will be published by Brill. This is the chapter outline. We're at the last sort of stages with the last review. So obviously, a book of this length, to try and capture in an hour is not possible, so I'm going to focus mainly on certain aspects that I think you'll be interested in, but mainly things like chapter 3 and 4 and 5, which are where I'll tailor them as well to the South Australian context. So we'll talk a little bit about South Australia there. So the book has sort of two dimensions, two origins. First was that it was an ARC grant titled Managing Migrants and Border Control in Britain and Australia. But even with this, I never envisaged writing this book, but it grew out of realising that the only European group and the only British European group, there aren't that many British European groups, by the way, obviously Maltese, you'd be another one, that was restricted to come to Australia were the Cypriots. As we will see, the Maltese actually had an assisted passage agreement, and they were the first country, obviously they weren't independent at the time, in the late 40s, to have an assisted passage agreement, but the Cypriots never had one. Obviously the Italians did, the Greeks did, an assisted passage agreement, but the Cypriots didn't. So when I began to realise that, I then began, so the project published over 20 articles. It ended in 2021. The money ended in 2021, we should be clear. But we continue to work on these aspects. These are some of the relevant publications. One of them, maybe I didn't list it there. Oh no, this one is chapter 2 from this book. So I've published something from this book already. And then the next dimension was when I went to Cyprus in 2018, and my uncle gave me this photo. It's a photo of my father, who is here in the white shirt, with others coming to Australia on the Corsica, which left Limassol in December of 51 and arrived in February of 52 with 762 Cypriots. So no other ship carried anywhere near that many people. That's something that I didn't know. I grew up with my father's stories, as I'll mention in a minute. Before I do that, the mouse works. So this man here is Sabas Antoniou, who is a very important figure in the Cypriot community in Victoria. And this is Agustis Nicolaou, all three very, very, very close friends for life. Before they took the voyage, and all the way until this man, Agustis, died first, and then my father passed away 6 years ago, and Sabas still alive, and he's the oldest. And I caught up with him recently as well. So I realized that, this was, as the title here says, a hell trip on a floating slum. So that was a quote from a woman, a mother who was on the ship. She was married to a Greek Cypriot man who was on the ship, obviously, and they were traveling with their children. And she was one of the people who were interviewed when they arrived, because she knew English. So she was interviewed, and she said this was a hell trip on a floating slum, and proceeded to go through a whole series of complaints. Now, I grew up with my dad's stories of the rotting potatoes and onions. The smell was foul. Obviously, you guys know when your potatoes or onions rot, it also liquefies into this disgusting liquid. So, you know, it was that side of things I knew, and I knew that the vessel had been quarantined twice in Djibouti and Colombo. So it was delayed there for many days, hence the long trip as well. But what I didn't know was other things, which I was reading about in the newspapers. The toilets and showers were blocked with, you know, I don't need to go into the details. Water for washing was polluted. There was at one point a black substance coming out of the taps. At other times there was the smell of petrol. There was even accusations by some of the passengers that the water had been deliberately polluted. Drinking water was limited. What they did was they had the tap for drinking shut, except for 1 hour a day where it would be open. And if you wanted water at other times, you had to pay, where they had another tap, I think, which they bottled water. They put water in a bottle and they would sell it. So there was a bit of a scam going on as well with the whole water. Food was limited to pasta and rabbit mainly. I don't mind, I love rabbit. But unfortunately, if I'm eating rabbit for 8 weeks or 6 weeks, I'm going to get sick of it. So that was limited. The fruit and vegetables were limited. The crew, there were Cypriots who were employed ad hoc in some instances, some cases. They felt pity on many of the passengers and they would fry potatoes and take them to them, especially if they had children. There was a lot of children on this voyage, as we will see when I get to some of the stats. The ship was under quarantine, as I mentioned. The watersiders in Melbourne, where they eventually was their final destination, they became ill because of the whole situation. They demanded, they said, we're not touching this stuff, and they eventually got extra money in order to remove the bags. Now, this was not the only voyage like this, although this was probably the worst, and it was also seemingly the last of the group, from 46 to 51. There are other voyages there, some of which also contained Cypriots, these voyages. The Migration, for example, the Hellenic Prince, the Protea, and the Liguria. The Liguria was the previous name of the Corsica. So the Corsica only travelled as the Corsica once, but it travelled under many names because of the, let's say, the scam nature of the whole enterprise. So here is the Corsica. The Corsica ends her unhappy 6 weeks voyage from Cyprus to Melbourne with, okay, not 900, but almost 900 migrants. She was no luxury liner. You can see she's tilting. She's that's another reason why she was travelling very, very slowly. Here we have the chaos which met them when they arrived. There were hundreds of Cypriots at the port waiting for them. People were throwing things from the ship, things that they didn't want to pay a tax on or whatever. And here is the tap. You can see the tap there, the black substance. And then that is the captain. So the captain is a very funny situation. Every person who I spoke to who was on the Corsica thought the captain was Italian. Turned out that the captain was Greek. Captain Ppiros. He blamed the Cypriots for everything. So he blamed them for the fact that, I mean, there was a lot of things that went wrong, right? They did not clean the ship regularly. Obviously, there were issues with the sewerage, there was issues with fresh water, there was issues with the potatoes and the onions, because they had gotten wet before they left Limassol. They had gotten wet in the rain. So the Corsica had 762 Cypriots. It left Limassol on the 13th of December of 51 and it arrived in Melbourne on the 4th of December of 52. It stopped at the exotic places of Port Said, Messawa, Djibouti, Colombo, okay, not so exotic, Fremantle, before it came to Melbourne. It was actually meant to go to Sydney, but it didn't make that trip. People who were meant to go to Sydney and on to Brisbane took a train. People coming to Adelaide were always going to stop at Melbourne, take a train, come to Adelaide. Now this painting here is by Michalis Michailidis, who is a famous painter who left Cyprus, I'm not sure, maybe in the mid-50s, and went to the UK. He lived in the UK, and You can see here that it's dated 1950. I believe he dated it later. I believe that he wrote his name and dated it later when he was going to do an exhibition. And he just got 1 year off with the dating, because I've had an expert on ships see photos of both the Corsica and this one, the Ravello. So I showed an expert photos, and he goes 100% that is the Corsica and that is the Ravello, which left on the same day. They both left on the same day. So I'm pretty confident. And what this photo shows is so many people there, thousands went to see them off. It was such an important event in Cyprus. 762 on one ship, and then I can't remember how many on the Ravello, 180 I think. So almost 1,000, just like that, in one day, gone. I'll show you the Ravello later, the statistics. So what I want to turn to now is, why did Cypriots emigrate? Why did they leave? So this is a little bit general, and then I'll go into some more detail around the phases of the movement. But Cypriots usually moved first from rural areas to urban areas, right? They would move to Nicosia, to Panikos, to Limassol, and so forth and so on. And then from there, they might stay there for a while. It may not work out, it might work out, but it may not, and they would then look to emigrate overseas. Now, early on, the emigration was primarily within the Ottoman world, and then when the British take over, it continues to be within that Ottoman realm for the first part. Places like Anatolia, Syria, and particularly Egypt. Obviously, Egypt becomes, if you like, British from 1882. There's a very large Cypriot community in Egypt at that time. They had clubs in Cairo and in Alexandria. That's how substantial they were. Now, what triggers the Cypriot emigration was global patterns, particularly from 1912, as we begin to see Cypriots move to North and South America and other parts of the British Empire, including Australia in the 1920s. So there's not a lot of movement to Australia before the 1920s. The economic motivations were triggered in part by globalization, also other global conditions such as the Great Depression and the aftermath of the two world wars, right? So that seems to trigger a larger movement. After World War II, we also see political motivations triggering people to move, the rise of communism and its anti-colonial character, especially post the formation of ARCEL in 1941, and also later on by the formation of EOCA, which triggered significant immigration from 1955. So basically, people want to get away. ARCEL was suppressed for a lot of this period by the British. There was imprisonment of its leaders and trade union leaders as well. And the party was banned for a lot of this time also. And we will see this with the statistics too. So if we go and look at the phases, the first phase is a short phase from 1912 to 1916. Before this period, it's very limited to within the Ottoman Empire, particularly Egypt. Very small numbers reaching Australia. Under British rule, the quality of life improved steadily. The population increased by 47% from 1881 to 1911. That's mainly due to things like the improved public health. But what did not keep up was unemployment. The economic situation did not match the increase in population. And we see unemployment at very high levels, at around 28-30% for much of this period. In 1912, immigration takes off because shipping becomes available, and people are very ready to go to North and South America, Western Europe, and again, they continue to move to Egypt. I mean, Egypt is a huge pole. It's very close, obviously, to Cyprus, and people can go back and forth. Then, in 1916, which I wrote about in this book, Serving the Empire in the Great War, about the Cypriot Mule Corps, basically the High Commissioner or Governor basically stops men of military age from leaving the country in order to push them to enlist into the Cypriot Mule Corps, and where they served on the Salonika front. We launched that book here, remember? Over there, in that room. So then emigration basically ceases, and then it picks up again when it's permitted, when the ban is lifted in 1919, and initially the great demand is for the United States, where there were 2,000 visas issued in 1919 and 1920 to emigrate, mostly for the US. But then we begin with the restrictions. The United States, visas were limited to men who were physically capable and could speak a European language. That sort of links or follows on from the Australian dictation test, right, where they could force somebody to take a dictation test. There's a similar thing going on here in the US with language. Further restriction to Cypriots was made whereby only if you had a close relative in the US could you apply, and then they applied also the US quota system, which restricted numbers going to the US even further. Now, during the interwar period, which is the period we're looking at, Egypt remained the popular destination. But people going there, Cypriots going there, would often go there with a plan to then go elsewhere, right? To migrate elsewhere, to use Egypt as a springboard to go somewhere else. Now, the Cypriot government placed restrictions as well on people applying to emigrate, and this was because they were getting a lot of Cypriots communicating with them abroad to say, we are now destitute, we need help, we want to come back. And they had to pay for them to go back. So the Cypriot government said, oh no, that's got to stop. We want a guarantor system. When you're applying to go to live overseas as a migrant, there needs to be someone prepared to sign to say that they will pay your costs if you're destitute at any point. Now that system worked and it didn't work. It didn't work if people were going to Egypt and moving on to the UK or wherever from Egypt. But it also didn't work when the guarantor turned around and said, well, I'm sorry, I can't pay, right? So that was also happening. As for Turkish Cypriots, in the Treaty of Lausanne, which was the last treaty of the First World War, which was with the Turkish Republic, 2,500 Turkish Cypriots ended up moving to Turkey. Actually 5,000 moved, but half of them came back as they weren't really happy there. Next we move on to the Empire of Australia. So Cypriots also begin to migrate to various parts of the British Empire, especially Africa. I think Senator Don Levendi, Anastasios Levendis, who established his empire really in Nigeria and Ghana. That was all facilitated, so to speak, by the fact that he was going to some place in the British Empire. But we're going to leave that. We're going to move on to Australia. There was a small and steady flow to Australia from 1924 to 27, but owing to some Cypriots not knowing English well enough and becoming destitute, the Australian government asked the Cypriot government to not approve applications unless Cypriots could prove that they had £40 in landing money. They had to, declare on their applications that they had the £40. This was only slightly less than for someone who was non-British. Remember, the Cypriots, in 1925, Cyprus became a crown colony, so there's no longer this ambiguity about their status. They were British. Now, according to the 1911 census, there were only 26 people in Australia born in Cyprus. And in 1933, this was over 500. So we are seeing an increase in the early and mid-20s. But then it slows down. And it slows down because they're going to the UK. This is where the main movement is, especially to London. In 1921, the British census found only just over 300 Cypriots in England. But 10 years later, it was over 1,000. And then by 1950, there was almost 20,000. Okay, I exaggerate, 18. But 13 of those were in London. London had its area, which was Little Cyprus. in and around Soho, for those of you who've been to London. But the British also had restrictions. They just weren't as restrictive, and there were ways to get around them. In 1935, they were forcing applicants to apply if they only had proof of sufficient funds for 2 months, had a skill, stated that they knew English, had a definite offer of employment in the UK, and if the applicant stood a good chance of keeping their job, they had to go to an interview, right? Normally with the district commissioner. In 1937, they increased the restrictions because they realised that they weren't quite working. You had to have proof now that you could speak English. You had to pass a sort of oral test. You had to pay a £30 bond, and then the other one was you had to have an affidavit. We've got lawyers in here today, they know what I'm talking about, from the Cypriot Commissioner's office in London to state that you had a job in the UK, and I think also accommodation too. I left that bit out. So it became a serious thing. But because the office in London was very efficient, it was not a difficult process, but it was time consuming. So now we have some statistics. These are the entries and the departures from Cyprus in the 1930s. Now I know this is not an accurate way of looking at migration because we don't know who's entering. But in terms of the departures, we're pretty sure that the majority of people departing were migrants. You can see here that we're not talking about a mass movement. Overall, for the decade, we're looking at just under 3,000, or probably it's on just over 3,000 if we count 39. We can see the dip in 32 because of the Great Depression. Countries were not taking migrants in. It doesn't really recover in 33, it only recovers in 34, and it's quite, it's not very high. When we get to the post-war figures, you'll see very huge difference. And this is what we're doing now, the third wave, from 46 to 52. Now in 1951, Cypriots leaving for Australia in large numbers, and probably more, at least in 1951, to Australia than the UK. This does not last, as we will see, because they declined sharply from 1953. We also need to remember, when we're looking at the stats in a moment, the difference between departures from Cyprus and arrivals in Australia. There's always going to be a difference. For example, the people on the Corsica departed in December of 51. So they are on the list for that year as departed. They didn't arrive until 1952. So on Australian lists, so the Cypriots arriving in their numbers, they'd be on the 52 list. So there is a difference we need to keep in mind. Cypriot departures to the UK increased sharply from 54. By the end of 57, it's estimated that there are 57 to 64,000 Cypriots in the UK. Incredible statistic. Cypriot arrivals to Australia marginally recovered in 55, but then declined again, as we will see. Between 49 and 52, these were the main years for the Cypriot arrivals to Australia. Specifically from February of 51 to February of 52, in other words, in a 12-month period, there was over 2,660 Cypriots that arrived in Australia, including you. So here we have two tables. I probably should have separated these, but anyway. Cyprus net departures and arrivals. So this is similar to the table I previously showed from the 30s, but I'm not giving you the departures and arrivals, I'm just giving you the net, right? And you can see here that in 47, the population, when we're looking at departures and arrivals, was fewer, so more people were leaving Cyprus, then more people just arrived in 48, and then we begin to see the increase. Okay? 51, almost 4,000 Cypriots departed Cyprus in comparison to arrivals. And we see an increase in 55. 55 was the biggest year, 5,359 departed. Obviously, we need to also look at arrivals as well. Maybe the arrivals will be on that year too. So the other table, it shows where they were going. Right? In 1951, 2,500 Cypriots were leaving Cyprus for Australia. This figure includes the Corsica from December of 51. These are not arrivals to Australia, these are departures from Cyprus to Australia. I do not have the UK, which is a great pity. If I did, I'd know for sure. But I could tell, given the fact that the movement to Australia is restricted here, and we see 3,100 here, I doubt that here we would be above 2,500, given that we are down below 2,000 here. So I'm thinking the UK would have been under here, under Australia. But this table clearly also shows the decline of departures of Cypriots to Australia from 52. There are only, I think, 2 main ships that leave Cyprus for Australia in 52, 356, 109 and 53. It picks up in 55, but then it declines again. You can see here, for a 3-year period, it's only 700. Oops. And also you can see they're not going anywhere else. They're not going to the US really, they're not going to Greece, and they're not going to Commonwealth either. Now, Cypriot arrivals and net arrivals to Australia on this side. So this now looks at arrivals, okay, coming to Australia. So we can see here in 51, their total arrivals was 1,600. In 52, it was 1,300. That's because Corsica left in 51, but they counted in 52 because they didn't arrive until 52. So that's why it's that high for 52. But then the decline begins. Only 165 in 53. Now, this side takes into account the departures, which are over here. People leaving Australia. Now, it doesn't tell us where they're going, it just says that they're leaving. So here you can see, for example, 1952 was a very big year for Cypriots to leave Australia to go abroad, somewhere else. And that's because there was a shortage of work. Unemployment was a big issue then. Okay. But you can see clearly, I think, from 53, the decline. Yes, it picks up in 55 for obvious reasons, but then declines again. Now we need to understand why. Why does it stop, more or less? Okay, so there were restrictions on Cypriots in place, still in place in 1946. But they were slightly more flexible without the requirement now to carry specific funds. As I mentioned earlier, the £40, they weren't worried about that anymore. Dark-skinned Cypriots were restricted. So on certain applications, I could see not approved, dark-skinned is written there. Sometimes they are Turkish Cypriots, sometimes they are Greek Cypriots. Assisted passage agreements, we need to remember, were agreed to with the Maltese government, but rejected for Cyprus when this came up. As we also know, Italy and Greece also subsequently had assisted passage agreements. The restrictions were lifted in 47, but in 48, Form 47 applications were frozen when nearly 1,500 applications were received in the first 5 months. The freeze was lifted in 49, but then they put in place a quota of only 50 applications would be processed per month. Then in May of 51, they decided that we're going to revisit this situation because they were complaining that the Cypriots arriving, and let's be clear, we're talking about a very, very small minority, but everybody suffered as a consequence. Well, everybody who wanted to come here suffered. People were arriving without the correct medical or character certificates. Character certificates were basically police reports. There were 5 who arrived with serious convictions on one voyage. I can't remember, 2 or 3 of them actually they sent them back, which was pretty tough. Applications would only be considered if Cypriots had dependents nominated by a close relative residing in Australia, and those on Form 47 only if a case presents outstanding features. In mid-1952, they added to the restrictions, capping them at 50 per month, regardless of the country of origin. Now, why did they add that little last bit there? Well, that's because people were leaving Egypt. People were leaving Egypt because of the Nasser regime. The Christians, Maltese, Cypriots, Greeks, others were leaving, and so they capped the Cypriots as a result of that. Here is my father's application to come to Australia. So his name, Varnava, whatnot. The key thing here is the date here. I don't know if you can see it. 23rd of April of 51, a week before the May restrictions kicked in. So in May, I think they started the restrictions. And this is the archival work that I was working with. These are the applications. This is the last one to be approved with Form 47. See, my dad had Form 47. Can you see that up here? Form 47. This was the last one here. His friend from the photo, Nicola, is here. The third last one to be approved. This was a very close thing, right, for these people. And they just made it before these restrictions kicked in. Oh, you can see there are Turkish Cypriot as well. Niazi. So we'll talk about this soon as well when we look at the Corsica. The restrictions continue until 1974. So this is my little bit about the period after. I haven't done a lot of research into the 70s and 80s, but I'm going to present something to sort of try to complete the picture. Firstly, in June of 56, the processing of Cypriot applications was frozen because the Australians said we can't go to Cyprus to process applications because it's not safe because of the Olga. Another reason was because the Communist Party here in Australia was organising mass demonstrations in favour of self-determination for Cyprus, which the Australian government was not happy about. So they didn't actually want to be bringing more Cypriots here. The freeze was lifted in 57 for one visit, and then it was reintroduced again. The Cypriots continued to migrate in large numbers after independence in 1960, but primarily to the UK. In 1961, 12,337 Cypriots from a total of 13,489 that emigrated for that entire year, they went to the UK. That's almost 92%. So it's a very substantial percentage. Obviously, following that, the 1,000 or so others, most of them would have been going to Australia, but I'm assuming no more than 500, around the 500 a year coming to Australia. In 1964, there was a proposal to allow groups of Turkish Cypriots to come to Australia, but that was rejected because the Australian government did not approve migration. After 1974, after the war, the Australian government introduced another scheme to permit up to 3,000 Cypriots from both communities, who were displaced. They had to, prove that they were displaced to migrate to Australia. Now, this program lasted for 3 years, and this is the 1981 census. So this census gives us a good indication of the movement again. This one looks at the Cypriots by their religion. By the way, so we've got 23,000. I do not understand, because I haven't obviously done all the research, why this total differs from this total. But anyway, why that's the case, I don't know. But anyway, we can see here that 77% were Christian, about 15% were Muslim, some were Jews, somebody converted to Buddhism, and the others were 8%, probably Maronites, Armenians, but also presumably atheists would be in this group too. Okay? Interestingly for us, we can see here there was a question about when they arrived. Pre-1960, 30% arrived before 1960. Now we need to remember that, well, some of these people may have left, some of them may have died. So that's a very high figure. 30% in 81 census arrived before 1960. A good number, 25% arrived in the 60s, into 71, and then from 72 to 81, but I'm definitely going to go out and say from 74 to 78, for those 3 years, most of these 10,000 arrived during those 3-4 years. And that's why it's at 43%. So now I want to go back and look at some of the voyages between December of 47 and January of 52. Where I'm going to go to is, well, who was coming here? First, I want to look at some statistics. Between the censuses of 47 and 54, about 5,400 Cypriots migrated to Australia. 2,623 arrived on 18 voyages. These voyages had at least 80 Cypriots on them. And these were from December of 47 to January of 52, so just before Corsica, okay? And then we have 762 on the Corsica. Now that puts it in perspective when we've got 18 voyages that are giving 2623 and one giving 762. The other 2,000, which we've got looped back to the 5,400, were from the 141 that came on the Florencia in April of 1952 and 90 on the Hellenic Prince in June of 52. We also have about 150 that came by air, right? They flew here in 48 and 49. And also, of course, there were ships that were not bringing 80 Cypriots. There were ships that had 50 or 40. I didn't look at them, but obviously they were happening as well. These are the 18 ships. I assume there will be some people here who maybe know somebody who came on it. Starting with the Mizra and ending with the Ravello. Oh, there you go, I didn't remember. 180 came on the Ravello. See, it might be. Now, what we can see here is that it begins slowly in 47 and 48. It picks up in 49. It slows down in 1950 because of the restrictions that I spoke about. And then they lifted them, and then we get more applications. And then in 51, look at that, a whole list, right? And look, it goes all the way from February to October. And then 1952, which, now if we compare the 762 on the Corsica, 291 Cypriots on the Asiminia, which is here, 282 on the Protea. They were very distant second and third, right? No other vessel brought 300 Cypriots, right? So that puts it in perspective about the Corsica with 762. Between February of 51 and 52, over 2,660 Cypriots arrived. Almost 50% of the arrivals between 47 and 54 arrived during that 12-month period. It's another reason why they have put the restrictions. There are too many coming. Now, on these 18 voyages, so this is the 18, right? I had to go through these one by one and work out who was a Greek Cypriot, who was a Turkish Cypriot, and so forth, okay? Now, Greek Cypriots were almost 88%. Turkish Cypriots were around 10%. Now, the point that I will make here is the point that I've made also in my book on the Cypriot Milk Corps. You can't work out who the Maronites are because they've Hellenized their names. So it's almost impossible to know. I'm guessing that this should be around the 60 mark, but I'm not going to go out and guess who is a Maronite when I don't know. So this will bring this a tiny bit down, but not much. The point to make here is that the Turkish Cypriots were not following exactly the Greek Cypriots. The Greek Cypriots made the move first, and then the Turkish Cypriots begin to follow the Greek Cypriots in moving. They were sort of one stage behind right? The Greek Cypriots. That's why their numbers are lower. Oh, this is the statistics from the 1946 census in Cyprus, which shows you that 78% of the population were Greek Cypriots and around 18, just under 18 were Turkish Cypriots. So that puts that into perspective. Now, the nationality and ethno-religious composition of the passages on the Corsica. So now we're moving to the Corsica, okay? There were actually 863 passengers on the Corsica, not including the crew, okay? There was a separate list for the crew. There were 761 that had British Cypriot nationality. Okay, I need to explain why we have 762 over there. And that is because one of the passengers was born in Egypt, had Greek citizenship, don't know why, because his parents were Cypriots, and he moved to Cyprus when he was 4. So I decided to count him as a Cypriot. I mean, he's not Egyptian, he's not Greek. He never even lived in Greece. So I counted him as a Cypriot. For intents and purposes, he was a Cypriot. So that's why 762. But on this list, he is here, because this list is nationality, or citizenship, if you like. And then we have other groups here as well. Stateless is very interesting. Stateless. Who were the stateless? There were Jews who were stateless. There were Greeks who were stateless, whose citizenship was taken because of their politics. So it's very interesting. Somebody needs to do work on that account a little. This is the age distribution of the 762 on the Corsica. What's interesting here is that most of the passengers on the Corsica were aged between 20 and 29. They were a little bit older than what somebody might expect. Okay, they had tried to make it work in Cyprus, but they decided on chancing their luck and coming to Australia. So you can see here, and then the third group was 30 to 34, not 15 to 19, which is very interesting because a lot of the people I spoke to would say that I was 18 or I was 19, right? So that is very interesting. The other interesting thing is that there were 60 children on the ship. So 762, 60 were children, 8%. That's a very high number when we go back and look at the other voyages. The other 18 voyages don't all have this information. We are very lucky with the Corsica that we have everything. Now, this one took me years to do. This was working out where they came from in Cyprus. So, the people on the Corsica, where were they from? I could only work out 541. How did I work it out? Well, firstly, thanks to people here. When I came several times, and I spoke to people, that was very helpful. And other people in correspondence as well from communities elsewhere in Australia, but also applications. The applications, like my father's, which I showed you before, would state the village that they were from. Okay? So I think I got over 70%, which is not bad. It's a good indicator of where they were coming from. And where they were coming from were small villages. Small villages of less than 900, over 40%. Next, large villages between 900 and 1,000, 23%. Needs to practice his accuracy. Regional centres, places like Panikos, right? Greater than 2,000 is next with 20%. In other words, if we add all of this up, right, we are looking at over 80%, somewhere around 85%, coming from regional areas, rural areas, whether they were small villages, which was the dominant trend, or larger. The movement was decidedly rural. Okay, let me familiarise myself with what this is. Yes, population by district in 46. So in the 1946 census, Kerinia had 28,000 people. All right, very small. So this is the population, okay? You understand? For the whole district. And that is the number on the Corsica. So we can see here that most of the people that I identified, the 541, came from Famagusta or Larnaca. 24% roughly for both, okay? Larnaca means, what that means is that Larnaca was overrepresented in terms of its overall population, because 11 or 12% of the population of Cyprus was from the Larnaca district in the 1946 census. But over 23% on the Corsica were from Larnaca. So we can see here that Nicosia was underrepresented, Famagusta was just over, Limassol was pretty much on the bang on, right? 17% with 16%. Ppiros was overrepresented. More people leaving, see, than their demographic distribution. So 12% of the population in Cyprus were living in Ppiros, but 19% on the Corsica were from Ppiros. And poor old Gerinia, well, maybe they just didn't have economic hardships there, but less than 2% on the Corsica.
So,
yes.
So for Adelaide, Famagusta would include Undesirable Larnaca would include.
I'm going to show you that in a minute.
Okay.
Oh yeah, I'll show you that. There you go.
Yeah.
So this table shows us those on the Corsica who came from, so 7 or more Cypriots from the same place. 7 or more. I couldn't fit any more, so I had to come up with a number. 39 that I identified. There might be more. There's 200 that I wasn't able to work out. 39 came from Aradipo. I've heard that almost 50 came from Aradipo. Rizogakaso, 22. I'm thinking that surely I would be married to someone from Rizogakaso. There shouldn't be anybody left out, but there might be. People, let's be clear, people did not have surnames. A lot of these people did not have surnames, right? They had their first name and their father's name sometimes as their surname, because your name was, like my father, Varnavas Mikhail Varnava. In his case, he had his name, but it was all right, Varnavas Varnava. But others did not have that third name, and they just had the first 2 names. So then it becomes even harder to work it out. Same with the mule call. Limassol. So you realise that we've got 2 very large regional centres here. I mean, Aradipo is a borderline regional centre. I mean, it's regional back then. Today, of course, it's not. So Limassol is a township, and then it's Larnaca, Marosi. Then we get Breya. Morfu, very large, very large. You would imagine it would be up here, but it's not. Now Horiopafos, and then we've got Nicosia, all the way down here. And then we have my mother's village, Iosilias. Very surprised that it's this high. We only discovered one only 2 or 3 months ago. I had to recalculate everything. You have no idea how that messed me up. Gomi Kepi, Tima in Pafos, Kornos in Larnaca. There are Koronotes in Adelaide.
We have.
Yeah, you have. Maroni in Larnaca and Yarusa, and here are the numbers for each place in the 1946 census. So you can see here, Aradipo and Rizogakaso, they are regional centers, right? But look, some of these places are very small. Nea Horiopafos, Iosilias, Kornos, go away. And Maroni, they're small villages, under 1,000 or under 900 as mine. So I'm going to now look at where were they going in Australia, and this partly explains this. Okay, but before I move on, there's one thing to mention. Lots of people were down to go to Melbourne, but left to come to whatever, Adelaide, for example. For example, there is the Agathangelu family, Panayota, from our church. Her family, They were down, or her mum I should say, and the kids, but dad was already here. They were down to go to Melbourne. Okay, so when we look now in the next stuff that I'm going to show you, they weren't coming here, but they ended up here. And there's a lot of other people from South Australia like that as well. Like Andrekos Varnava, who went to Melbourne first and then came to Adelaide. You know what I mean? Yeah. The geography of Cypriot settlement in Australia. So where were they going? Okay, in 1952, Cypriots lived in every state and territory in Australia. And in urban, peri-urban, suburban and rural areas. But their main areas of concentration were the CBDs and the peri-urban, that is the very inner suburbs, which were within 5 kilometres of the CBD. This is where most of the Cypriots lived, worked, socialised, where they had their clubs, where they had their kafenia, you know, the ad hoc kafenia, their eateries where they would go to eat, and their homes actually as well, as we will see. Over 70% of the Corsica Cypriots were going to the CBD and the peri-urban suburbs. And I've been able to identify what I've called belts of settlement. Sorry for the typo, sorry. Clearly identified in Melbourne, Sydney and Adelaide. Right? And we will look at this and we are getting to the end. So this is where they were going. In broad terms, over 50% were going to Victoria. But I've also said that some of these people left straight away to go elsewhere. 35% to New South Wales, 7% to South Australia, Queensland, even 3 people were going to New Zealand. Now, the other table breaks it down into rural and suburban, roughly the same, around the 14% mark, rural and suburban. And then you can see over 70% were peri-urban and CBD. Oh, and I could only find 594 because the list only gave the actual addresses for 594. For the rest, it just said Victoria or New South Wales or whatever. Cypriot passengers going to rural areas. So New South Wales was ahead, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia. The ones who went to South Australia, Andreas Pistola from my mother's village, Iosilias, and Vasilis Kauna from Aradipu, did I say that right? Maybe I didn't. We're going to Port Pirie, and then George Lysandrou from GOCSA was going to Berry. Both Port Pirie and Berry had Cypriot, particularly Port Pirie, had Cypriot communities, but I also know that Berry did as well. Suburbs. Now let's try to think for a minute. In 1952, there was very little suburbia in Australia. Suburbia was only evolving or developing in the 50s and through the 60s, okay? In Melbourne was the highest here with 67%. In terms of Adelaide, sorry, let me just finish with Melbourne. 10 were going to Sunshine. Is that a surprise? So Sunshine starts from back then as an attractive place to settle because there were factories there which Cypriots worked in. There were also going to places to Sunshine where Maltese were living there in very large numbers. Most people think of Sunshine in those days as a little Malta, but it also seems to me to have been a little bit of a little Cyprus as well. The other one was Brunswick. Brunswick is actually quite close to the city, but just fell, not by much, into the suburban category. And the other one, to a lesser extent, Paran. Again, very close to the city, we would say, but just fell into the suburb category. In terms of Adelaide, 6 were going to Theberton, including Despina Murali with her 2 children and Eleni Gnatiou, who were all from GOCSA, Panagiotis Orfanou from Odyssey Festival, and Michalis Paraskiva from Aradipu were going to Belula Park. George Maxtel from Aradipu was going to Torranceville, Therios Simeos from Aradipu, and George Kalabashotis, I'm surprised from Kalabassos, was going to Hectorville. So not many, right, were going to suburbs. The movement was here, okay? So 72% were going to peri-urban and CBD. Melbourne, over 50%. 136, 62% of Cypriots were going to addresses in Fitzroy, Carlton, and the northern and eastern ends of the CBD, right? Basically around the, Russell Street, that area, all the way up to Exhibition. Including 12 were going to the Democratus League, right? Or Panikos, which was then on 217 Russell Street. Now all of these people, the 136, thanks to Google Maps, I could work out, was only a 20-minute walk, right? They were only 20 minutes away from each other. And less than that to get to the CBD, and some of them were in the CBD, obviously. In Sydney, a very similar percentage, almost 60% were going to another sort of belt. Darlinghurst, Surrey Hills, Wolloomooloo, I'm not from Sydney, sorry, Wolloomooloo, yeah. And the two clubs, the left-wing Atlas Club, so that was a broader Greek club, which was on 252 Pitt Street, and the Cypriot Club Evagoras, which was on 192 Castlereagh Street. So 60%, they were all concentrated in this belt living. This was more like a triangle. They were literally 15 minutes from each other. And now for Adelaide. So Adelaide has an even higher percentage of the people coming to SA were going to this area. So 84% were heading to addresses west of King William Street. Sorry, I cut a little bit off there, of King William Street. Between Hindley Street in the north and Sturt Street in the south. In other words, from they were here to here. All of the residences were in this area. I reckon a 20-minute walk from one end to the other. Again, 20 minutes. We need to remember the Cypriot Club in those days was on 129 Hindley Street. Okay? There were also other Itanetu Fundi. Okay? I think Fundis was in back then. And there were rooms that people could stay in, just like the ones in Melbourne, just like the one in Sydney. There were rooms that people could stay in. But also, these places were given as a destination, even if they were not going there. My father was down to go to 217 Russell Street, or Democratos, but ended up staying somewhere else, nearby, but still. The point is that they were used. There were even passenger lists where everybody from Cyprus was going to just one address, which I mean, not possible, right? 50 people or whatever it was. They also had supermarkets, which were as well. I think it was on Franklin Street, there was a supermarket. There were two supermarkets, which were owned by Brill. Okay, so we are at the end. I just have now the list from South Australia. It's over 2 slides, I apologise. So you can see here the information. Last time I gave my talk, I was not able to work out where they were from. Now I was able, thanks to your help and luck also from the archives, I was able to work out everybody. This is where they came from. Now we're going to get whispers and talking. So you can see here, as we already know, most of the people were from Aradipu and Rizokapasol. But we all know that there was already a substantial settlement from Aradipu and from Rizokapasol in the 1920s. And that's the chain migration bringing others here to Adelaide. And also here as well. So, thank you for coming. I really appreciate the turnout. And once again, thank you to the Greek Orthodox Community of South Australia. Thank you to the Cypriot Community of South Australia. Thanks to both presidents. Thank you to Sophie. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you for your incredible research and patience and passion for this subject. We're all indebted to that. I'm just curious, there were times when the migration from Cyprus was restricted and then it was on, it was off. There was a period, clearly, they were 56, they were worried about it all going. Before that, and you said there wasn't the restrictions from Malta, which was also a British colony, why was there restrictions from Cyprus?
Maybe the question also is, why were there no restrictions on Malta?
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
In 1919, the Maltese government, also colonial government, okay, decided that we have this huge problem that's been with us for decades, overpopulation. Malta is a very small island, it is a very small country compared to Cyprus, right? The British bases in Cyprus are 99 square miles. Malta is 125 square miles. So it gives you a perspective, very small. In 1919, the Maltese government established the Department of Immigration, an office dedicated to pushing the Maltese to leave. Get them out. That's what their solution to overpopulation was. Malta has to import a lot of its food, particularly fresh food, and has a lack of land and housing, and just like Cyprus, it lacked basically they lacked finance to develop the country. So they established this department which basically wants to send Maltese to Australia. They decided Australia or bust, basically. So they are constantly lobbying the Australian government, constantly. In the interwar period, there were restrictions on Maltese. Their restrictions were also similarly the Cyprus ones were not just, they didn't come out of thin air. They were based on other models. In the interwar period, the Maltese were restricted to 50 as well, per month. I think it was 50 per month, for a time being. But then, through lobbying and whatnot, they got that done away with. And then they appointed in the mid-30s a Maltese commissioner in Australia, who ostensibly was meant to look after the Maltese, who were already here, but also dabbled in a bit of lobbying. We want more to come. Then, towards the end of World War II, just after World War II, they begin the process of lobbying for the assisted passage agreement. So the first country, Malta of course was part of Britain at the time, it was a colony, but the first country, so to speak, that had an assisted passage agreement after the UK was Malta. And at around the same time, there are ideas from Cyprus to do something like that, but Australians don't want to have anything to do with it. They do not want to encourage more Cypriots to come here. They already can see that Cypriots want to come here. Now, the assisted passage agreement with the Maltese and the ones with Italy and Greece and so forth, we think of them as assisted passage agreements, and they were. They were to partly fund people coming here. So basically the Maltese one, I can't remember the ratio, but for argument's sake it was a 50-50 thing. Australia would pay half, Malta would pay the other half, or something like that, I can't remember. But the other thing to say is that the Australians had the right to set the quota. So every year they could say 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, or whatever. The Maltese wanted more. They wanted to push more, because they were overpopulated. Their economy was largely also based on the British military in Malta. And as the British military began to slowly remove itself, so to speak, from Malta, they began to panic. Because the British had not encouraged, really, other significant industries to develop, just like they hadn't really encouraged them in Cyprus either. So, in terms of the Cypriots, to be specific, so there's the usual, racist stereotypes. They're no good, they don't work, they don't speak English, they haven't settled well. But that was a very small minority. If we look back at one of my very earlier articles that I did, sorry, I'm going to have to very go back here, on the London Cypriots in the 30s. The London Cypriots, although it was a very small minority, they did some quite naughty things, right? The top one, creating a suspect community. They did some naughty things. There were 4 murders in the space of a year or two I mean, murders, they attract attention. There was a lot of destitution. There was a lot of Cypriots who had health issues, ended up in hospital. So that explains a lot of the British restrictions. But even then, we talked about it, those restrictions, they weren't as restrictive as the Australian ones, or indeed the US ones. So Cypriots could still go to the UK, they just had to jump a few hurdles. But in Australia, they were far more strict. As soon as certain people began to arrive with not the correct papers, or the fact that they let these guys through that had criminal records, there wasn't a lot of criminal activity in connecting Cypriots in Australia. There was one or two things, but there wasn't anything really. The other thing was, they were clearly linked to the Communist Party. So they as a distinct branch. So you had your Greeks, and then you had your Cypriot branch. And your Cypriot branch, they speak about it as a distinct thing, but also linking to self-determination, the movement for self-determination. They drew direct links with Hegel. They knew, for example, who was receiving Hegel literature in Australia. They were monitoring them. ASIO was monitoring them. That's this article here. This one. And this one touches upon it too, but that one looks at the UK as well. But this one just on Australia. Yes?
On one of your previous slides, you talked about, I think it's different ethnic groups immigrating from Cyprus, and on the top of the list you had British Cypriots.
Yes.
Is that the Greek Cypriots who were under British rule, or was it something about emigration to the UK back to Cyprus?
No.
Back?
Sorry,
Who was that group?
That is Cypriots with British nationality from Cyprus.
British nationality.
So, this one.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, Cypriots during the British period had British nationality. So, to be precise, in 1925, or until 1925, nationality of the Cypriots was very ambiguous. It's very complicated to get into it. Because until 1914, nominally Cyprus belonged to the Ottoman Empire, but it was occupied and administered by the British. So basically, a Cypriot would have a document going overseas to say that they could go to a British representative, something, but they weren't British. And then from 1914, we have another sort of ambiguous, anomalous situation until 1925, when Cyprus becomes a crown colony. But then in 1946 or 47, or is it 48, then they introduced a specific colonial nationality. And they took on, obviously, that colonial nationality, as did everybody else. So this is Cypriots, their nationality. As I said before, there was one who had Greek nationality, but I took an executive decision to count him as a Cypriot because he was born in Egypt to Cypriot parents, and at age 4 or 5 he went back to Ppiros, where his parents were from. He never lived in Greece, he never had any connection to Greece, so why should I count him as a Greek? What happened there was another article that I've published touches on this. A lot of Cypriots in Egypt found it easier to go to the Greek consul to get identity travel papers. So that's what they must have done for this child, and his parents must have gone there.
But just to clarify, your response to that question is that all Cypriots
Are British,
at the time
yes.
are British
Yes.
subjects.
Yes,
That is
yes.
described as.
Yes.
And that's Turkish and Greek.
Yes, and these British other are mainly Maltese. Yes, there were some Maltese who lived in Cyprus, not many, but some. And there were also some other British from Egypt as well. This guy was a Greek. He was a Greek. We went back to get, well, I believe he went back to get a wife, and he was already an Australian citizen. Unless he was a Cypriot, but I don't think so from the name. No, and also he didn't get on in Cyprus. putting a bit out there.
I have a question.
Yes, Sophie.
Yes. In all of this migration since the early 50s, I'm wondering if you've come across that and whether you've been able to research anything, or you know other people who've done some research in the area just about the young girls that were sent out here, and often they just received a photo of a man who may have been a lot older than the photo represented, and sometimes they ended up in good families and partnerships, and other times they were in domestic and family violence relationships. I'm just wondering if you are able to talk to that, or if you could refer me to anything.
We know, of course, that because of the restrictions, women were not necessarily as restricted. Okay, so fiance, and that was very sort of flexible. Would qualify as a close relative to come out, and that's how many of these women came out. I don't have specific stories, but again, here the statistics, right? If we look here, when the restrictions begin to kick in, we don't see it impacting the female population in Cyprus or Australia. Can you see?
Yeah.
Higher than the men.
Yeah.
In 1953, only 45 men arrived in Australia. So that period, the phase, I suppose, of Cypriot migration shifted. By force it shifted because of the restrictions. And we see it decidedly shift towards a female population arriving in Australia. Because the men who had previously arrived, normally, I didn't include this because we would have gone a lot over time, but the book talks about the statistics on who was married and single and whatnot. Most of the, well, not most, I changed what I said. A majority were single. There were quite a few who were married though, and they would then bring their wives over later. But also people who were single had a view to bringing their fiancé, or they would come over and then work it out later. They'd bring somebody out later. Yes?
You showed the distribution of people from urban and non-urban areas, that most of them came from non-urban. Yes. I guess you have figures for what the distribution was in Cyprus itself as a sort of a baseline comparison?
Yes, the book does. Off the top of my head, I don't.
So is it disproportionate from the rural areas?
No, it's not. I suppose it's not. I suppose. Oh, that is a question. Yeah, I mean, what I can say is that out of all these categories, there were more small villages than anything else. But obviously they are small. So there's lots of small villages. So yeah, I don't know the answer to your question. It's a very good question. Whether it aligns with the population more broadly. I think I do talk about it a little bit in the but I don't have it here. Yes. Because obviously when we're talking about urban and semi-urban, I'm talking about the townships, and those townships that had suburbs in those days, which were not many, but Nicosia and Panikos did. Some people would put down, Ayos and who that was Ayos and Panikos, for example. So that got counted here. But there weren't that many regional centres, right? But obviously 2,000 population is a lot. So potentially this 40% is a reflection of where most Cypriots lived in Cyprus in 1946. As I said before, we do see some Cypriots moving to urban areas, right, before they immigrated. But that wasn't necessarily on their application. It wasn't always indicated. One guy, the guy Savas Antoniou, I mentioned before, he was born in Aganthon. He grew up, I think, in Ppiros, and then he lived for at least 10 years before he emigrated in Ppiros. So how was I supposed to count him? He was born in Aganthon, he grew up in Ppiros, but he lived for 10 years in Ppiros. So I decided to count him as Ppiros. He came to Aganthon. He didn't even live there. He was born, but his parents were not from there. His father was a police officer, and he was just stationed in Aganthon. I asked him, "What do you want me to do?" And he goes, "Ppiros." And I said, "All right, Ppiros." But that was an unusual case because I could speak to him, obviously. Yes.
I'm Australian,
Yes.
born and sitting there, and I found it quite interesting.
Yes.
It's quite a shame that it wasn't really advertised, because I think a lot of people would benefit.
Yeah. Well, we're video recording it, so it will be put on YouTube. I have a YouTube channel where I try and put my talks, so I don't have to repeat them again. But yeah, I think this is a good term. Any other questions? I'm going to I'll go back to the list of names so people can look at the names and see if there's anybody that they know. Quite a few people, like I said, that you may know are not on these lists, like Andrekos, right, who went to Melbourne but was a Corsica Cypriot. Vasilis Andreou from Aradipo, who used to go to our church, he passed away. Vasilis Andreou, he was on the Corsica. He also went to Melbourne, so he was in the Melbourne list. Did not stay in Melbourne very long and came to South Australia. Ppiros or I forgot his first name. I can't remember if it's Christos, because there were two brothers. But one of them came on the Corsica. He was the president of the Greek community, I think. Marinos. Christos. Αντώνε. Ο ένας από τους δυο, he was on the Corsica.
Yes, και αυτός που ήταν στο Corsica είχε δουλέψει σαν κατρόπι.
Μπράβο, ναι, δούλεψε ως... Ναι. Αντώνης, ναι. Πήρε την κομμύδα, πριν τα πέθανε. Ναι.
Πρέπει να ήταν ο Κώστας.
Ο Κώστας, ναι. Δεν θυμάμαι. Ναι.
Μάλιστα όλα δείχνουν εδώ. Στην πρώτη εβδομάδα που ήρθαν εδώ πέρα έχει πεθάνει τη μητέρα του και η μητέρα του.
Ήταν πλούσιοι. Unfortunately, most of these people have now passed away. I think Ppiros is still alive. Είπαμε την Παναγιώτα, Παναγιώτα Γραφονγέλου, she's still alive. Her brother was the one who has the butcher shop on Theberton Road.
Are you looking for more information about these people?
I found them. I found where they're from.
Yeah. Do you want any more information?
No, I found what I wanted.
Yeah.
But I don't have the other 200, but they were coming here. But yeah, there's another 200 where I couldn't work out where they were from because I couldn't find their applications. Norris?
I don't understand if the
Yes.
there's
Another name?
yes.
The name is the person who was going to receive them. So they had to nominate on the passenger list. This is from the passenger list. And they had to say who was going to receive them. So take, for example, the Suderci family. So we have Olga here traveling with her kids. Her husband, I don't know his name, Andreas Antonis Adams. See? Alpha Suberchi. He was going to receive them. He was going to be responsible for them.
Well,
Here, Anetuyani was going to be received by.
You've got 259 Weymouth Street, Adelaide, the Yuan, which is my father's name.
Oh, yeah.
That's where we live.
There you go.
Not here.
Yeah.
So
this person, is it this one? Mirofora? Oh, this one. Yorgos
and the next.
and Mirofora, right? They're married to you. I'm assuming they're married. They were going to is that the one?
Yes.
259 Weymouth?
That's Metaphora, isn't it?
Yeah, Mirofora.
Oh, I remember her living when we moved to Southampton.
There you go.
So
you're basically.
Dimitri and Sivan.
Huh?
Dimitri and Sivan.
Yeah, so there you go. You did. I bet you didn't expect the personal connection.
I remember when I was 3.5,
Yeah.
in Tiny Cottage,
Yeah.
walking down. One day I escaped the garden and Mum wasn't looking, and walked down to Light Square.
Yeah.
And I was a little boy, and one car went round the square, a Morris Minor. I thought I better get back home.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, it's got their occupations.
Oh yeah, I left that
The
thing.
fourth column. Presumably, there's lots of farmers, but they were moving into this urban city. So where were they? Do we know which factories or where they were going or what they're?
No, I don't. We don't know. We don't know. But what I make the point that these people, not only were they coming from rural areas, but the majority of them put down that they were farmers. My dad being one of them. He wasn't a farmer. He was a son of peasants, basically, who grew stuff. In his particular case, whatever they did, make a little bit of money out of that. But many others didn't, right? They were just growing stuff, subsistence living. So it was a huge culture shock. Some of these people, even if they had known the urban areas in Cyprus, like Nicosia or Varosi or Limassol or whatnot, they would not compare to Melbourne, Sydney, and probably not Adelaide. It would have been a huge shock.
And a lot of them would work at Holden's.
Yeah, they worked
because they had just opened up.
Yeah, there were lots of metal factories. There were people who were going to Port Kembla, for example, around Wollongong. Again, metal. The Port Pirie people, Port Pirie. Again, we know what the industries were. Most of the Cypriots, as I said, lived in the CBD and in the peri-urban areas. They would have worked in Holden. They would have worked in other companies as well. Housing was a big thing that they worked on, not just automobiles. Housing was a big thing as well. Yes?
Those names, are they ones that flew as well?
No, these are from the Corsica.
Oh, okay.
This is just from the Corsica. This one here, they're two cousins, right, from Araviku. Mitsiori.
They're his brothers.
His brother, yeah.
One of them is.
One of them is we can't two cousins, yeah. They were cousins. So there's a lot of people who are travelling together.
Someone's going to a PO box.
PO box, yeah. That's because he's going to Port Pirie. That's because he's going to Port Pirie. But also there were others as well going to Queensland like that as well.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah. People. I did bring some of my books if people are interested to purchase any. This was the first one. British imperialism in Cyprus, 1878 to 1915. The Muleteers book, as I call it. Then the next one is on World War I, up until 1925. This one is also on the gender and the Greek version as well. And these are some other books that I was involved in.
Θέλω να ευχαριστήσω τον Andrekos Varnava, τον συμπατριώτη μας, για την πολύ ενημερωτική διάλεξη που μας έδωσε και στοιχεία τα οποία πολλοί από εμάς ίσως πρώτη φορά σίγουρα πρώτη φορά τα βλέπουμε. Ευχαριστούμε, σου ευχόμαστε καλή πρόοδο στο έργο σου. Είμαστε ευγνώμονες σε σένα για το έργο που επιτελείς, για την παροικία μας, γιατί αυτά τα πράγματα μένουν αιώνια για την ιστορία της παροικίας μας, αλλά να προσθέσω επίσης ότι ο Andrekos είναι ευρύτατα γνωστός και στους πανεπιστημιακούς κυρίως κύκλους της Κύπρου. Και βλέπω τακτικά αναφορές στον Andrekos Varnava μέσα από διάφορα συγγράμματα άλλων εκπαιδευτικών, πανεπιστημιακών, καθηγητών κλπ. Που σημαίνει ότι ο Andrekos είναι πλατιά αναγνωρισμένος όχι μόνο εδώ στην Αυστραλία, αλλά και στην πατρίδα μας. Σε ευχαριστούμε, Andreko. Σας προτρέπω να πάρετε κάτι να διαβάσετε από τα βιβλία. Νομίζω είπε ο Andrekos ότι υπάρχει και κάτι στα ελληνικά. Ένα πολύ ενδιαφέρον βιβλίο αυτό. Και θα ήθελα να του προσφέρω σε ένα μικρό δώρο ως εκτίμηση για την παρουσίαση που μας έκανε σήμερα εκ μέρους της ελληνικής κοινότητας. Ευχαριστώ επίσης και τον πρόεδρο της Κυπριακής Κοινότητας, τον Χρήστο Ιωάννου. Έλα εδώ να βγάλουμε μια φωτογραφία. Και όπως είπα με τον Χρήστο εδώ πέρα, είμαστε και οι δύο Κύπροι μεν, αλλά αντιπροσωπεύουμε δύο κοινότητες, την ελληνική κοινότητα και την κυπριακή κοινότητα, οι οποίες ήταν και πρέπει να παραμείνουν πάντα αδερφωμένες σε αγαστή συνεργασία και είμαι βέβαιος ότι με τον Χρήστο ως πρόεδρο της Κυπριακής αυτό το πετυχαίνουμε. Και να πω επίσης και για τον Ιάκωβο τον Διγενή, επίσης ένας άλλος ένα άξιο παιδί της Κυπριακής παροικίας, που υπηρετεί και η Σοφία που έβαλε την περισσότερη Σοφία Γιαννατή, απόγονος ενός άλλου γνωστού μετανάστη που ήρθε από το Ριζοκάρπασο πριν πολλά χρόνια και υπήρξε στέλεχος της παροικίας μας και μέλος του Διοικητικού Συμβουλίου της ελληνικής κοινότητας, όπως επίσης και της κυπριακής κοινότητας. Η Σοφία έβαλε την περισσότερη δουλειά για να οργανώσουμε αυτή τη διάλεξη και πάντα πρωτοστατεί στην συνεργασία των δύο κοινοτήτων μας. Σας ευχαριστώ.
Εγώ ήθελα να ευχαριστήσω στην ελληνική Ορθόδοξη κοινότητα και στον πρόεδρο τον Παναγιώτη που έγινε αυτή η εκδήλωση στο ίδρυμα της Κυπριακής κοινότητας για τους πρώτους Κύπριους μετανάστες και φυσικά τον Andreko που είχε την καλοσύνη σήμερα και πριν να έχουμε και άλλες εκδηλώσεις εδώ πέρα που να γνωρίσουμε την ιστορία της Κύπρου καλύτερα από ό,τι την γνωρίζουμε. Και ελπίζω να έχουμε πολύ περισσότερο κόσμο στα επόμενα. Χίλια ευχαριστώ σε όλους και συγχαρητήρια και για τη διοργάνωση του Οδύσσια. Ήμουνα εκεί την Παρασκευή το βράδυ που άρχισε. Ήταν τόσο άρτια που ίσως όσα τα χρόνια που είμαι στην Αυστραλία πρώτη φορά να αρχίσει και να τελειώσει στην ώρα.